Welcome to the Fran Snyder Podcast, where I talk to artists and music fans to explore how music connects us through great stories and experiences. Brought to you by the Listening Room Network. Today's guest, Layla Frankel. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great, great. So you are based in Nashville, but from Illinois?
Chicago, yeah.
Yeah? Performing with your dad was kind of like the early start. You want to tell us a little bit about
Sure.
about the early days of Layla?
Yeah. My name is Layla Frankel. My father is Joel Frankel, and he has a long career in children's music in Chicago primarily, but kind of all over the U.S. And so I grew up on stage with him, sort of singing background vocals and then sometimes singing lead. And I was, kids music. You need kids on it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Fortunate for my dad, I could carry a tune from a young age. And so
you started singing really, really early then.
Yeah.
And somehow that took you to the Old Town School of Folk Music. And that's one of those sort of iconic schools that I've heard about a zillion times, but don't know much about it. I imagine it'd be good for you to share your experience there and what exactly that place does.
So my father has taught there, still teaches there. And he primarily teaches guitar. So I sort of grew up in that facility doing Wiggle Worms, which is like their kids music program. And so I was at the school taking classes from a very young age. Basically Old Town School is sort of a community hub for folk music, but music of all styles with sort of the folk mentality. So it's like anybody can sing, anybody can play. Let's all just get together and play music. And it kind of takes the rigid academic aspect of learning music out of the picture and makes it more about community. So that's kind of their
mission
values. Yeah, their mission.
And they've been it's got to be around 40, 50 years, or how long's that been there?
Oh yeah, probably 50 years or so at least.
Yeah. It's one of those things that you see in interviews or mentioned and it's one of I've never really fully learned what it was.
Yeah. As of the past 15 years or so, they've definitely expanded to being more than just music classes, and it's art classes and it's dance classes and it's, various styles of music. So they're trying to be sort of a center for arts, community-based arts in Chicago.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you continued to study music. You went to college?
Yes. So I went to University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and I studied jazz vocals there, and then quickly realized that I was a little out of my element in that I grew up listening to rock and pop and soul, and I think I gravitated towards jazz vocals because it was either like jazz vocals or classical vocals. And as somebody who enjoys pop music and the blues, I was like, okay, jazz is definitely more my lane, but I wasn't obsessed with listening to jazz the way that many of my peers were. So I still sort of stuck with singing in big bands and combos, but switched my major to creative writing so that I could focus more on poetry, because I knew that I wanted to be writing songs, and lyricism was a big catch for me.
Are there any techniques or skills that you picked up doing the big band jazz stuff that either are totally relevant or totally irrelevant to what you do now?
I think the thing that has tied over the most is that I find I gravitate towards kind of the jazz-oriented song structure. So I tend to write a lot of what's called AABA song form. The Beatles did it a lot too. You sort of find it in a lot of jazz standards where it'll be like two verses, sort of a bridge or a chorus section, and then a verse again. And I've always sort of found myself gravitating towards that style, probably because of the aspect of poetry that it lends itself to. You can sort of shape a story from that pretty easily.
And so the last line of the verse would be a refrain, something like you
exactly
repeat, right?
Like,
instead of having a chorus, you have a refrain.
Right. For instance, like, you can't take that away from me. Mm-hmm. Can't take that away from me. That's like the one line that keeps repeating throughout the song. And there's a lot of sort of jazz standards that follow that suit.
You've embraced that form and continue to use it for your own writing.
Often, yeah.
Yeah.
I tend to.
Got it. Uh, Imagine jazz hands don't apply. There were no wasted skills, right?
No, no wasted skills. And I think also just learning how to lead a band, learning how to, there's a lot of hand motions that go into cueing cutoffs and cueing, which section after solos, which section of the song you're going to go to. And I sort of learned just how to be on stage and communicate physically instead of verbally.
Great.
And that was a good skill too.
Great. And then at some point you took a travel break. Tell us a little bit. That sounded like quite an adventure.
It was an adventure. I have always kind of been a soul with wanderlust. That's just something I have. It's part of my spirit. So I took what I called a life break a few years back, the fall of 2015. And I just sort of packed a backpack and I booked a ticket to Ireland one way. And I was like, I'm just going to go backpack through Europe. So went to a few different countries, Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, Spain, Italy, and kind of backpacked around, did a lot of hiking, then did what's called work away. So there were different spots in these different countries where I would, work on a farm for a few weeks in exchange for room and board.
And this was totally on your own, not with a friend. Yeah.
Well, the first 5 weeks I did with a friend.
Okay.
And then after that, met up with a different friend, but also in between was kind of on my own and just meeting travelers. And that's the beautiful thing about traveling solo is you meet so many other people who are doing the same thing and from all over the world and a lot of free spirits. So. Did
you do some busking, or I understand you did some playing over there, right?
Yeah. So I ended up meeting a friend on the flight from Vienna to Rome. Just like a random guy sitting next to me who was young and really interested in music. And he saw that I had my baby Taylor with me. He said, well, if you need a tour guide in Rome, I'll show you around and we can go to all these open mics. So he kind of took me on a tour of all these different open mics in Rome and played a cafe show. And then I did the same in Spain, open mics, and ended up playing a full set in Granada just because I was chatting with an owner of a restaurant and they're like, we have a stage, come play. So it's kind of amazing the spontaneity of that culture in general, but the willingness to just sort of explore and experience art spontaneously. It's cool.
Yeah, one of the things that I love hearing from artists on our site is that although we don't have a ton of activity in Europe, there's a handful of hosts who have really created a launching pad for artists to go to Europe for the first time to play.
Yeah.
I was able to do that myself in 2015 and do like 9 shows in 6 weeks in Germany and France, which is not really a tour. It's more like a working vacation, but it's just a fabulous experience to meet people and to see the world that way. So yeah, I always admire people who do that at least once. In terms of recordings, by the way, I love the Josephine video, the Josephine song. That's a really wonderful piece of work there. Congrats on that. Apparently you've done one EP, but you're working on releasing a second. Is that the deal?
Yes. Yeah.
So tell us about what's in the can and ready.
Yeah. So the last EP was my first EP, and as many sort of indie artists can tell you, I think the first one is kind of like you're learning what it feels like to release music. And I'm very proud of Tame the Fox. I love it. But it was where I was then. It was a Chicago, low-key production, and just kind of rounded up my friends and had sort of a basic band instrumentation. The latest project came to be when I spontaneously met Reba McEntire's guitar player and producer, Jim Kimball, at a party. And we just started talking music, and he said, "You're good. I can tell that you're good just from a conversation about music." He's like, "You're good. Send me a song." And so I sent him a couple songs, and he immediately messaged me back and said, "Okay, I'm going to call you, but let's record these." It started as an idea for a single, and then it sort of evolved into a full 5-song EP plus bonus, so 6-song EP. And it's been just the most amazing experience because, I'm in Nashville. I'm kind of in the big leagues. I'm playing with players who have done this their entire lives and are on a lot of records you'd hear on the radio, a lot of records for very famous artists. And it was a pleasure getting to play with those instrumentalists. And we recorded it at Starstruck Studios, it was formerly Reba's place, and now it's her ex-husband's place. But just state of the art, beautiful studio. And one of the highlights of my life, probably getting to record in that space with those players.
And you had a very successful Kickstarter to help fund that. I think you raised like
Yeah,
$20,000. So you've got some people
close to it.
who
Yeah.
believe in you and are rooting for you. That's for sure. That's great.
Yeah, I feel very blessed.
So with the pandemic, COVID hits, and you mentioned that you'd been doing some service industry work
Yeah.
to supplement what you do, and it's kind of allowed you to maybe take stock that was not healthy for your life. You want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Sure. So back in Chicago, I was living more of the freelance musician life, in that I was teaching some music classes and I was playing wedding band gigs, and you kind of piece it together. But when I moved to Nashville, it's much more competitive, and everybody's sort of trying to get the same gigs, and there's so many talented people. So as soon as I moved here, I kind of got stuck in the service industry because it's a way to make a paycheck,
Right.
But it's also time and it's energy, and I would come back from my shifts way too exhausted to even pick up my guitar. And so you kind of get stuck in this loop of, well, I want to play, I want to get out, but I don't have the time to put into making that life happen. So when COVID hit, it was such a blessing for me as a musician, because suddenly I had all of this time to write and learn how to record from home, which is something I was trying to learn how to do for a long time, but didn't have time for it. And I didn't realize the wear and tear on my body that the service industry was doing, and just how physically exhausted I was as well. And it's hard to be able to be in a state to create when your whole body is fatigued. So
for me, talking to artists on this podcast and even just on the phone, it's been really great to hear how this pandemic always seems to produce silver linings. As difficult a time as it is for so many people. Certainly there's some artists and people who adjust automatically. They maybe already had a side gig that was working, and they were just able to just lean into that and make the shift. Others, like me, took a month or two to sort out what are you going to do with this time.
Right.
Certainly starting a podcast is not unique. I'm doing other things as well, but the idea that when you're a touring songwriter or just an artist or in your normal life, and there are things that creep into your routine. Certainly with being a touring act, it's all the travel that takes you away from home, and you spend more time driving than playing usually. And you have this list of things that you always want to do and can never get to.
Mm-hmm.
And now we hear about people planting gardens and taking good cooking classes and leveling up in all these different ways. So it's really great to hear those stories. It's super encouraging. And I hope that these changes have a lasting effect on people, because there is so much good stuff going on despite the headlines.
Absolutely. And I think the other piece of it for me too is I was kind of struggling with, I hadn't launched the Kickstarter until this past June. So COVID already hit. And so, I'm working this restaurant job, and I'm kind of struggling with believing that my music is worthy of a full career, that that I'm able to support myself on my music, and I'm working for that, but I wasn't in a place to actively be living that yet. And then when COVID hit, I had the time to put into the Kickstarter. I had the time to play live stream concerts and really learn how to play live streams, and then reach, my whole audience of all my fans everywhere, which is why live streaming is beautiful. And then now I'm gearing up to launch a Patreon. So it's kind of like, I think giving myself space from the restaurant job has allowed me to sort of meditate a bit on what I want my life as an artist to look like, and how to actually make that happen, and sort of get past the hurdles of the self-doubt that every artist faces when they're trying to get into this lane.
If you are enjoying this podcast, can you pause for a moment to like, review, and subscribe? Please help the world discover our music community and the wonderful artists we support. Your feedback makes a difference. Yeah, and let's talk about valuing music. I think that's an issue for a lot of artists. I think there's a couple of critical decisions, and that is, number one, are you okay with doing art and funding it some other way, so that you don't have to stress about, will this art create income? Whether that's branching out from your normal genre, even if you have an established base in a particular genre and you want to do a different kind of record, or a different kind of project with other people. This whole idea of like starting over again. Every time that you reach or try to grow as an artist, sometimes it can make that logical progression of growth turning into financial growth a little bit more elusive, right?
Yeah.
And growing up, when I first started playing, I used to, I don't want to say make fun of, but I would look down on people that kept a day job and claimed to be an artist. And, it's just like, if you're an artist, be an artist, do that, figure out how to make a living, But I saw these people have a great impact regionally and locally while raising a family and putting kids through college and doing it, and keeping a good marriage together. And it seemed, when you're young, you might not really appreciate those things. And then as I've gotten older, I look back and I see these people 30 years later, 20 years later, they're still making music. They're still happy. They still have a family. They did all those things. And I've really just come around to the whole idea of respecting people who don't require their art to be their living.
Yeah.
I think it's something that artists have to really give a lot of thought to with an open mind. I was pretty closed-minded. I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to tour. I'm going to go everywhere and anywhere that will hire me. And I'll do anything and everything to be a musician full time. And I wound up playing, happy hour gigs for drunk people that I didn't like. I wound up, playing songs that I didn't want to play. And, living in Florida, playing on the beach, people thought I was living the life. And I was miserable. I was absolutely miserable. But I could say, hey, I'm making a living playing music, but I was absolutely miserable. So I think it's an important thing, especially for young artists, to realize that you can value your music in different ways. And one way to do that is to have another income that allows you to do art exactly the way you want to do it, without having to worry about market forces and, bottom lines and profit and loss and those kinds of things. So
absolutely. And I think that's the exact conversation that goes through every artist's head is, how do I do this? And because there's very few artists that actually get to make their full living off of entirely being an artist. It's the celebrities. That's hard. That's a hard life to get to. And I think a lot of the time musicians end up sort of playing gigs where they can get paid and they play songs they don't like, and that's just part of it, but at least they're playing music. And I think that's kind of choosing the path of, I'm going to teach, I'm going to play wedding gigs, I'm going to play birthday parties, but at least it's sort of acknowledging that this is my skill set, this is what I can provide, and maybe there's some moments where I don't get to play the music I want, but it makes up for the music that I do get to play,
right,
music that I want to play, and those moments when I do get to play them. So
right, because there are people who were doing the beach gigs in Florida and they were totally happy, and I respect that. But
sure,
you got to be true to what you want to do.
Right.
And the funny thing is, it comes around full circle. These people that we respect because they make a living playing music, they get to that celebrity status, and now they're writing children's books and they're doing movies and they're doing all these other things. We are complicated human beings. We can do more than one thing, right?
It's true. And I think the thing that I have to keep reminding myself is the point of all of it, the goal of all of it is to be serving the world, right? It's to be providing a service and bettering the people around you. I think that's just what you need to be seeking out. If what you're doing isn't fulfilling you and you're not bettering your community from it, then find something else to do in which case you are actually serving. So
yeah. And on that note, let's talk about the entrepreneur group that you are in.
Yeah. So I've got a couple things going on. So one is, it's actually led by somebody I met through Folk Alliance, which is where I met you. Emily Ann Peterson she wrote a book about bravery, and she has an entrepreneur group that she's launched called the School of Bravery. There's these meetings where we'll get to connect with other entrepreneurs around the country, and sort of talk about our projects and keep each other sort of focused on achieving the goals that we're setting out for ourselves. So I think that kind of community is so necessary for just keeping yourself on track and being inspired by other creatives.
And there's a measure of keeping each other accountable too, I imagine.
Absolutely.
which is a big thing when you're working on your own, doing art. You know, you fall into perfectionism and it's never done and you never ship, right?
The other thing too is that just speaking of artistic communities, I've started a Sunday songwriting challenge. So every Sunday, I've started a Facebook group with a few of my songwriting friends, and every Sunday we'll generate a random word and we'll have 90 minutes to write a song. And that's been just such a fun way of staying connected to my friends and keeping us all sort of creatively focused, but also just taking the pressure off of writing all these songs. I think so many artists get in their head about, does it fit my brand? Does this song fit my style? And then you sort of end up putting all these limitations on your writing. So this is a challenge to get away from that.
And a lot of times just forcing yourself to write a crap song for the deadline will often plant the seeds for something that's really great that comes out of it later. Because 90 minutes, it's tough to deliver a great song every time.
Oh, they're not always great, but they're a song.
Right, exactly. And let's talk about the Naked Vocalist podcast. I'd love to hear about, the different podcasts that artists listen to. You mentioned several, but that's the one that jumped out at me. So tell me about the Naked Vocalist.
So I'm just a vocal nerd. I think the Naked Vocalist, so it's these two really goofy British guys with a lot of character, and they do these videos, and then it's also a podcast where they basically talk about vocal technique. They talk about different exercises that will help cater towards different vocal muscles and strengthening your voice in different ways. But then they also talk about vocal health. They'll do interviews with other vocal instructors and just sort of give you the span of a greater knowledge of that instrument. And I grew up singing in choirs since I was 11, and then on and on and on. And so, and then taking vocal lessons. And so it's definitely it's been an obsession since a young age, because I play the guitar and I write songs, but I think my voice is my primary instrument. So it's fun to just be able to listen to these guys talk about what is happening vocally, what's happening in the muscular operation. I don't know.
Yeah. So they totally break down the physics.
They break it all down.
Yeah.
So it's great if you want to nerd out about the voice.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check that out.
Check it out.
And we also have a book in common that I love, Atomic Habits by James Clear. Yes. I read that earlier this spring. I'm curious if there's anything that you took away from that top of mind.
Well, his whole thing is, talking about how to make routines habitual. If you say you're going to be a writer, you have to write every day, or if you say you're a reader, you have to read every day. And just making these changes in your life to accommodate those titles that you're putting on yourself. And so for me, the thing that I took away that's been the biggest change on my life is it's kind of the compound effect is what he talks about. So, if you're writing a joke every single day, eventually you're going to have a set. You're going to have a stand-up set, but it's not so much about putting pressure on yourself to write for a half an hour, write for hours and hours and hours every day. It's write for 5 minutes. And then if you go past that 5 minutes, great. But if you don't, at least you can check that box and say you wrote for 5 minutes. And just trying to sort of incorporate a daily routine of just a short amount of time to keep yourself, making that a habit. Yeah.
The compounding of good habits and bad habits have a massive impact on our life. And he also talks about removing some of your bad habits that are limiting you in some ways.
Did you feel like that book influenced you? Like, did you make any changes in your life after you read it?
It's funny because I've been kicking myself lately about needing to reread that book because it felt there's really not anything that new in the book. But it's brought to light in a super effective way. Mm-hmm. And what I did right away is chart some things and create just this overload of things that I needed to do. And rather than starting small, I created some great master plan that I was not able to see through. So I need to go back and, pick that apart a little bit and say, okay, what 1 or 2 changes can I make every day?
Right.
Rather than
the whole thing is trying to keep it, changes you can make that make it actually achievable. So.
Right. But I highly recommend it. It felt like a paradigm shift. It felt like, okay, these are things that I kind of knew, but they've been made more relevant and easier to apply than ever through this book. So yeah, like I said, I want to go back to it, and I certainly recommend it to a lot of people, because the compounding is one of those things that affects you in so many ways, and it's elusive, because it creates, kind of like this exponential growth that people don't really understand. We think in linear terms, but just like investing a little bit every day, or allowing yourself to get into investments that have compound interest, your habits create compound results as well. It's one of those things, you don't have to do a big shift. If you're just 1% better at something each week or each month, over a year's time or a couple of years' time, that can make a drastic difference in your life.
Absolutely.
I want to encourage people to check out your video for Josephine. That's really a lovely song.
Thanks.
And
so that's one that's going to be full band on the upcoming EP. So the video, for those of you who haven't seen it, is just me and a piano, very stripped down version of this pop ballad. But there's full band, there's strings on it, which has been, it's so fun to get to have songs with strings and horns.
Nice. And you are also part of Listening Room Network. Definitely want to recommend people to check you out there and look at possibly booking you for house concerts and listening rooms in the next year. I think by March or April of next year, things will start opening up more consistently. Yeah. So thanks for your time today, and it's great to get to know you a little bit, and I'm sure we will talk again soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Layla.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Fran Snyder Podcast. Please subscribe, like, or share to help your friends discover this community. Also, I'd love to hear from you with any feedback or suggestions you have. And if you'd like to learn more about house concerts and listening rooms around the world, please visit and join listeningroomnetwork.com. You can email me from there. See you next time on the Fran Snyder Podcast.